We knew that was going to happen.
We're not Jerry right here.
Waiting for Omar to tell me. Okay, so we're going to get going. First of all, I'd like to say good afternoon and welcome to all of you for joining Human Rights Watch for this news conference to launch our World Report 2020. My name is Emma Daly. I'm the Communications Director at Human Rights Watch. And I will do a little bit of housekeeping before we go into the main event. So with me today is Ken Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Sophie Richardson, who's the China Director at Human Rights Watch, and as many of you know, Lou Charbonneau, who's the UN Director. So we will, first of all, I would like to say that we're extremely grateful to the UN Correspondents Association for hosting us here today. As many of you know, we were planning to launch our report in Hong Kong, but unfortunately, Ken Roth was denied entry, so instead we're here with you all today. Ken will be making a statement, and then we'll take questions from journalists. So please do identify yourself and tell us which outlet you're from. And please, I would like to restrict the questions to the journalists in the room. And if you want to do interviews with Ken later, then please let me know afterwards. Before we start, for those of you who don't know, Human Rights Watch works to protect human rights in more than 100 countries around the world. And we're really working to build a world in which people can really enjoy their human rights, a world in which people are able to speak freely, to love who they want, to worship or not where they want, a world where they can put food on the table, where they can send their children to school, where they can see a doctor. That's a world in which human rights are respected. So with that preamble, I'm going to turn it over to Ken for the main event.
Well, thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. As you all know, I'm here to release this year's annual Human Rights Watch World Report. And as Emma mentioned, this is a report that we put out annually. It's a bit different from our usual reports, which usually focus on one country or one issue. But this is our annual effort to do a global compendium. But before I get into this, let me just say a word about why we're here at the United Nations in New York. Is that,
Have this one.
Oh,
Here, let's
okay,
just
just switch.
We'll just switch.
is that better? Ah, okay, let me start over then, okay? Sorry. Okay, as I was saying, we're here to release Human Rights Watch's annual World Report. This is a global compendium that we put out once a year on human rights conditions in about 100 countries around the world. It's obviously different from our usual reports. Typically, we put out a report on one country or one issue at a time, but once a year we look at the whole shebang. And I typically will introduce the report with an essay highlighting an important global trend, and that's what I'll discuss in a moment. But before I go there, I just wanted to say a word about why we're here at the United Nations in New York, since, as Emma mentioned, this wasn't our plan. I had hoped to hold this press conference in Hong Kong, but the Chinese authorities had a different idea, and they blocked me at the airport. Now, this is the first time I have been blocked entering Hong Kong. I'd gone there previously. I actually haven't been blocked going into a country since 5 years ago trying to enter Egypt to release a report on the Rabah Square massacre there. And I was just in Hong Kong less than 2 years ago to release a Human Rights Watch report on gender discrimination in the Chinese job market, and that had been utterly uneventful. I held the press conference in the same place I was hoping to hold the press conference this year. But that wasn't to be. Now, what was different this time around? The Chinese Foreign Ministry actually explained yesterday. They made the preposterous claim that Human Rights Watch is inciting the Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters. Now, think about that. It's first of all, it's insulting to the people of Hong Kong. because they don't need Human Rights Watch to tell them to stand up for political freedoms, the rule of law, and democracy in Hong Kong. This is something that they're very capable of wanting on their own. And indeed, we just saw the same weekend that I was being blocked how deep the desire for democracy is just across the way in Taiwan, where the Chinese government's repression in Hong Kong and at home, but it's particularly in Hong Kong, its violation of the one country, two systems understanding was clearly a big reason why the founding campaign of President Tsai was turned around and she ended up winning in Taiwan. So, it's hardly fair to the people of Hong Kong to pretend that Human Rights Watch had anything to do with their desire for democracy. It's also, frankly, ludicrous that my colleagues and I have the capacity to mobilize 1 million people or more on the streets of Hong Kong repeatedly over the last 6 months. So, why did Beijing put forth this preposterous explanation for barring me? I think the reason is that the Chinese government is terrified of admitting this genuine desire for democracy on territory that they rule. Because if they admit that this is an indigenous and natural, a spontaneous desire, rather than what they claim it's a foreign imposition, it's Human Rights Watch inciting people, then what's happening in Hong Kong might spread to the mainland. And that's really the big fear. So, frankly, rather than concoct this ridiculous explanation, we think Beijing would be better off listening to the demands of the people of Hong Kong and respecting the freedoms and the rule of law that they promised in 1997 under one country, two systems for 50 years. But sadly, that seems to be less and less respected. So now, coming back to the World Report. The global survey, as I mentioned, I always introduce it with an essay about an issue of global importance. And this year, we're focusing on the Chinese government's role in the world. And as I'll explain in a moment, because the Chinese government depends on repression at home to stay in power, it sees human rights as an existential threat. But its reaction to that is increasingly posing an existential threat to the global system for the defense of human rights. Now, at home, the Chinese Communist Party worries that if they were to permit political freedom, it would jeopardize their grasp on power. And as a result, it has constructed an Orwellian high-tech surveillance system and a sophisticated system of internet censorship to try to monitor and suppress any public criticism. Abroad, the Chinese government is increasingly using its growing economic and diplomatic clout to silence critics and to carry out the most intense assaults on the global system for enforcing human rights that we've ever seen. Now, I don't pretend that the Chinese government is the only government violating human rights, and I don't pretend it's the only government that is trying to undermine the human rights system. We're aware of Trump, for example. But China stands out for the reach and the influence of its anti-rights efforts. The rationale begins at home. Within China, President Xi Jinping is overseeing the most pervasive and brutal oppression in decades. Dissidents are silenced, civic groups are shut down, independent journalism is no more, online conversation is curtailed. The small steps that had been taken toward the rule of law are now clearly replaced by the Communist Party's traditional rule by law. Hong Kong's limited freedoms are severely challenged, and for the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims of Xinjiang, Beijing has built the most intrusive system of surveillance that we've ever seen, and coupled it with the largest case of mass arbitrary detention in decades. Now, these are troubling trends, and to avoid criticism of them, the Chinese government is trying with increasing ferocity to use its economic and diplomatic clout to silence critical voices abroad and to undermine global institutions that protect human rights. China has obviously long censored critics at home, the government is now trying to extend that censorship to the rest of the world. Now, one obvious target is governments, which Beijing insists applaud it in international forums and join its attacks on the international human rights system, or at least refrain from criticizing the Chinese government's repression. Now, some governments willingly go along, including the dictators and autocrats and monarchs who themselves have an interest in undermining the human rights system that might hold them to account. Several important governments have been missing in action. Trump has lost credibility because he so often embraces friendly autocrats rather than defend the human rights standards that they flout. The European Union has been diverted by Brexit. It's been obstructed by nationalist members. It's been divided over migration. And as a result, it's often found it difficult to adopt a strong common voice on human rights. Other governments are simply bought off. One good example is Pakistan, a major recipient of the Belt and Road Initiative. And as an illustration of this, when Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan visited Beijing, he had nothing to say publicly about the persecution of his fellow Muslims in Xinjiang. Now, there have been rare exceptions. One important one took place at the United Nations, where about 24 governments banded together to criticize the repression in Xinjiang, initially at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, and then later here in New York at the General Assembly. But to show how the Chinese government operates, it then organized a counter-statement, which shamelessly applauded the repression in Xinjiang. And remarkably, up to 54 governments signed on. Now, these were not exactly the most human rights respecting governments. They're the likes of Russia, Syria, North Korea, Myanmar, Belarus, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia. But nonetheless, a significant number of governments joined on to China's self-applause. Now, one would have hoped that at least the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the group of 57 mostly Muslim-majority nations, would have come to the defense of their fellow Muslims in Xinjiang, as they did, frankly, for the Rohingya Muslims who had been ethnically cleansed by the Myanmar military. But instead, the OIC commended China for, quote, providing care to its Muslim citizens, end quote, if you can believe it. Now, the Trump administration has at times stood up to China, as best evidenced by its imposition of targeted sanctions in October. But moves like that have been undercut by Trump's praise for Xi Jinping and for other friendly autocrats, as well as by his administration's refusal to impose targeted sanctions on the officials responsible for the persecution of Muslims in Xinjiang, as well as, frankly, by his administration's own domestic abuses, such as the separation of children from their families on the US-Mexican border. Moreover, the Trump administration's misguided withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council because of concerns for Israel has paved the way for the Chinese government to exert greater influence over this key institution for the defense of human rights. Now, Chinese authorities have also attacked powerful business voices, using the threat of denying access to the Chinese market, 16% of the world economy, to penalize critics. Recent targets include the National Basketball Association for a tweet by the Houston Rockets general manager in support of the Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters, a tweet by a guy in Houston leading to ripping up temporarily, at least, this huge television deal with the NBA. Another victim was the British soccer team Arsenal, because a player voiced concern for the Muslims in Xinjiang. Through this kind of economic pressure, China is extending abroad the censorship of critics that it traditionally exercised at home. The Chinese government is also targeting academic freedom worldwide. Now, the goal of maintaining the flow of Chinese students who often pay full tuition has made universities, uncomfortable with standing up to China. So in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, the United States, Some pro-Beijing students have sought to shut down campus discussions about human rights abuses in Hong Kong, for example, or in Xinjiang or Tibet. In other cases, students from China have told us that they feel that they cannot join controversial debates about China for fear of being reported to Chinese authorities with consequences for their families back home. Now, because a central purpose of the United Nations is supposed to be, and in fact is, to promote human rights, Beijing has made the UN a major target of its efforts, which frankly is why we're here. At the UN Human Rights Council across the way in Geneva, China routinely opposes every tough human rights initiative that criticizes a particular country other than Israel. In recent years, China has opposed resolutions condemning human rights violations in Myanmar, Syria, Iran, the Philippines, Burundi, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Yemen, Eritrea, and Belarus, to give you a sense of the scope of this opposition. China also seeks to distort the international human rights framework by suggesting that economic progress should precede respect for human rights. It also tries to reframe human rights issues so that they're only a matter of voluntary cooperation rather than legal obligation. When China's own human rights record came up for review in 2018 and 2019 at the Human Rights Council, Chinese officials pretended to play along, but they threatened delegations that criticized Beijing while encouraging allies to heap praise on the government. Its diplomats gave blatantly false information while preventing an independent group focused on Xinjiang from even speaking to the Council. Now, here in New York at UN headquarters, a major Chinese government priority has been avoiding discussion of its conduct in Xinjiang. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been unwilling to publicly demand an end to China's mass detention of Muslims, while heaping praise on Beijing for its economic prowess and for its Belt and Road Initiative. In addition, often working in tandem with Russia, the Chinese government has taken an increasingly regressive approach to any action on human rights by the UN Security Council, where it obviously has a veto. For example, in September, as 3 million Syrian civilians in Idlib province faced indiscriminate bombardment by Russian and Syrian jets, China joined with Russia to veto a Security Council demand for a truce. Beijing has also made clear that it will not tolerate pressure on Myanmar for its atrocities against Rohingya Muslims, and along with Russia, China has opposed Security Council discussion of Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. In all of these cases, Beijing would rather leave victims to their fate rather than generate a model of defending human rights that might boomerang on its own repression. Now, let me conclude just by noting that the Chinese government's ascent as a global threat to rights is not unstoppable. But rising to this challenge is going to demand a radical break from a business-as-usual approach. For example, leaders who visit China should stop pretending that quiet diplomacy suffices. If they cannot be heard by the people of China, the main engine of change, their interventions are going to make little difference. That's a lesson for Antonio Guterres in particular. Governments should also avoid the double standards of so-called China exceptionalism. If they seek to hold Myanmar officials accountable for their abusive treatment of Rohingya Muslims, why not Chinese officials for Uyghur Muslims? If they're attentive to Saudi or Russian efforts to buy legitimacy, why not similar Chinese efforts? If they encourage debate about human rights violations by Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or Venezuela, why not China? They rightly challenge the Trump administrations for its appalling separation of children from their parents on the US-Mexican border, so why not challenge the Chinese government's separation of children from their parents in Xinjiang? In addition, governments should deliberately counter China's divide and conquer strategy for securing silence about its repression. When governments deal with China on their own, they often opt for silence. But if they band together, the power of balance shifts. For example, if the whole Organization of Islamic Cooperation were to protest against the Chinese government's repression of Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, Beijing would need to retaliate against 57 countries the Chinese economy cannot take on the whole world at once. And economic pressure goes both ways. Governments should press businesses to ensure that their supply chains are not infected by the forced labor of Muslims in Xinjiang. Similarly, governments should stop rolling out the red carpet for Chinese officials without insisting on real progress on human rights. A state visit should come with a public demand, for example, to give UN investigators unimpeded access to Xinjiang. Unless we want to return to an era in which people are pawns to be manipulated or discarded according to the whims of their overlords, the Chinese government's attacks on the international human rights system must be resisted. Decades of progress on human rights are at stake. So is our future. Thank you.
So we're going to take questions. Could you just wait for the mic, and then we'll start over here. And introduce yourself, please.
James Bays from Al Jazeera. Obviously, a lot of the attention is on you being barred from entry to Hong Kong. Perhaps you could describe for us the sort of repression that's going on in China and the scale of it that perhaps they were trying to prevent you from detailing here.
Well, I mean, as we detail in the China chapter in this report in quite a bit of detail, this is the most severe period of repression that we've seen in decades in China, probably going back to the Cultural Revolution or an era like that. Xinjiang is the worst, where 1 million or more Uyghur and Turkic Muslims are in detention for forced indoctrination, basically to pressure them to renounce Islam and their cultural traditions and even their language. There is this incredibly intrusive surveillance state that has been built foremost in Xinjiang, but is slowly being rolled out elsewhere, the so-called social credit system. The idea of penalizing or rewarding people according to their conduct, so far is focusing on just more ordinary behavior, but easily could be extended to political behavior as well. But if you look at, what remains of critical voices, of civil society, of independent journalism, all of that has been wiped out. And so, yes, the Chinese government didn't want me in Hong Kong, the only place where it was even possible to hold this press conference. But they didn't want us talking about either what's going on within China or the Chinese government's efforts to stop global discussion of that repression by undermining the human rights system.
I just want to see if Sophie has.
Yeah, if I can just add a quick point that, one of the great success stories of human rights in China in the last 20 or 30 years really was the rise of an independent civil society community, lawyers, writers, journalists, who really in the 90s and the aughts were key to proposing certain kinds of legal reform or asserting a kind of space for independent activism. That community has come under an unprecedented assault during President Xi's time in office. And indeed, just this morning, word came that yet another activist named Chang Weiping, who'd been very involved in arguing for positive rights for people with HIV, for example, or hepatitis B in access to jobs, was taken from his apartment last night. Last December closed out with the Chinese government hunting down, a group of about 10 activists who'd been so bold as to get together to have dinner to talk about the importance of public asset disclosure, an issue that the party itself likes to talk about. The fact that, even small gestures like that are not tolerated, I think, is a powerful statement of the current government's hostility to rights.
Thanks, Sophie. I think we're going to Celia next.
Thank you. Celia Mendoza, Voice of America, Latin America Division, and that gives you a hint of my question. You were mentioning how China has used the United Nations to support countries that are violators of human rights, especially Nicaragua, Venezuela. What you can see now that Venezuela is part of the Council for Human Rights in Geneva, how you see this partnership that they have built with countries like Venezuela and what we have seen with those countries in the region?
Yeah. Well, look at while I've outlined this serious threat that the Chinese government poses to the global system, I don't want to be defeatist because there is very significant pushback. I wish there was more, and that's what we're trying to galvanize with this report. But Venezuela is a good example of a situation where there has been substantial pushback. Now, Maduro would like nothing more than to treat, the dispute as a kind of a mano a mano with Trump. That's his comfortable terrain. He can stand up to, what he would describe as American imperialism. But in fact, the push for human rights and democracy in Venezuela has not been led by the United States. It's been led by the so-called Lima Group, a dozen Latin American democracies plus Canada. And that is unprecedented. Traditionally, Latin American governments did not criticize each other's human rights abuses. That was something the United States did. And that taboo has been broken. So the Lima Group has been criticizing Venezuela. It was the lead at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in securing adoption of a critical resolution that led to a fact-finding mission. And it has even gone so far as to send Venezuela to the International Criminal Court. So Maduro is basically isolated within Latin America, other than Nicaragua and Cuba. And he's still hanging on. He's obviously utterly indifferent to the fate of the Venezuelan people. There is massive lack of food and access to medicine, which is the key thing that has driven 4 million people to neighboring countries. But that isolation is the best option for a more democratic future for Venezuela. And this has happened, despite Russia's and China's backing of Maduro, and it has happened, frankly, without U.S. leadership. Indeed, I think U.S. leadership probably would have made it harder to get as far as we have, rather than easier. This has been very much a Latin American government initiative.
Thank you. Betül Yürük from the Turkish news agency Anadolu. You're also talking about the human rights violations in your report about Turkey, and I wanted to know what the most worrying human rights violation for the human rights in your report, and what would your message be to the Turkish authorities? Thank you.
Well, within Turkey, we've been very concerned with President Erdogan's manipulation of the democratic process and his, unwillingness to accept either a free media, there are many, many journalists who have been locked up, or even competitive political parties, since he continues to charge and imprison Kurdish mayors, but actually the leading opposition figure who's been imprisoned today. Now, despite all the tools at the Turkish government's disposal, Erdogan has not been able to stop the Turkish people from pushing back. And we saw this in the local elections. In Istanbul, Erdogan tried for a rerun, but even the rerun didn't work. And so, the AKP, his party, ended up losing the major cities, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, et cetera. So there clearly, on the part of the Turkish people, is growing discontent with Erdogan's self-serving autocratic rule. But we can't minimize the enormous amount of power that he has. Now, it remains to be seen as he loses Istanbul, as he loses some of these sources of the massive corruption that has enabled him to continue to buy support, things may change. But for the time being, we've gone from a country that was increasingly democratic with a real vibrant democracy, certainly an active press and active civil society, to one that is much more constrained because of Erdogan's repression.
Thank you very much, Errol Avdovic for Publica Press. Just wanted to ask Mr. Roth again. Since you have criticized heavily Secretary General Guterres in your more than a year article in Washington Post, and you are continuing now with saying there is no business as usual that can be done by the UN chief. What is the, and you mentioned there is a lesson for Guterres. Can you explore a little bit on that? And do you think that with this kind of treating rather human rights, Mr. Antonio Guterres should run for the second term?
Well, we've obviously spoken privately with the Secretary General a number of times, and we went public. I published that piece in the Washington Post really only after a number of unsuccessful private exchanges. And I don't want to pretend that the Secretary General never does anything for human rights. I mean, an example is he actually stood up for the Human Rights Watch researcher whom Israel deported. So there are times when he does stand up for human rights, but he's been very reluctant to speak publicly in focused terms about human rights, particularly if the abuser is a powerful nation. So you'll see him make these broad statements like, I urge respect for human rights, or I wish all parties would respect human rights, or, things that are nice generic statements, but nobody feels the heat. And if no one feels the heat, statements like that don't make any difference. Because governments have their reasons to violate human rights. It's a way to stay in power. And unless you change that cost-benefit analysis by raising the stigma attached with violating human rights, you don't change the governmental conduct. And so that's why we've pushed for much more pointed public statements about human rights. Now, he will tell us, I raised this privately. But as I mentioned, the agents for change are almost always the people of the country. That's certainly the case in China. You're seeing this in Hong Kong right now. So the real test is, are you helping the agents of change? And if you make some private representation in the back room of the foreign ministry and nobody hears you, it doesn't make any difference. Especially when the public presentation is this nice photo op and everybody's smiling and shaking hands. Imagine the message that the public takes from that. It's that the Secretary General is supporting the Chinese government's current path. So the only way to erase that impression is to say something publicly and not some generic, respect rights on all sides, or, not saying we expect human rights to be respected in fighting terrorism, which is actually the Chinese government's narrative for Xinjiang. It's not what the Secretary General should be saying. What's needed is pointed public criticism to raise the cost of human rights violations. And we don't see that coming out of the Secretary General's office nearly enough.
These records?
Yeah, Samini, sorry.
We have a lot of people. I'm
Sorry.
sorry. We have a lot of people, so I think we need to move on.
Just to follow up.
Samini.
Well,
Hi, what trend lines do you see, broadly speaking, for environmental activists, particularly at a time when we've seen a surge of civil society activism on the specific issue of climate change and climate action?
Yeah. I mean, I think that probably the case can be made that the most dangerous form of activism today is to be a rural environmental activist, because the people who are standing up to the miners and the loggers are the ones who are getting killed. I see that frontline activism being essential for the fight against climate change. And let me give as an illustration of this what's going on in the Amazon today. Because Brazilian President Bolsonaro has been basically giving a green light to the criminal networks who have been attacking the forest defenders. Not just the environmental activists, but also indigenous people, and even the government officials who've been tasked with protecting the environment, but who themselves are under attack. So that green light is why we've seen a surge in deforestation in the Amazon. And destroying that important carbon sink is contributing negatively to climate change. So, in our view, the defense of the environment and the fight against climate change, a key element has to be the protection of environmental activists. And they are the ones on the front line who are being killed.
over here, and then over here.
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from I'm here on the.
Oh, there it is.
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from the Daily Arabic Al Arab Al Jadid newspaper, the New Arab. I have a follow-up regarding Mr. Guterres and then a question. The follow-up, you talked about statements. Do you think also, in addition to statements, he has the power and maybe the more possibility to go into more interpretation and to take action to regarding Human Rights Watch? And I'm here having in mind the issue that Mrs. Anis Kalamar, when she criticized the Khashoggi case and the fact that the UN didn't follow up, and specifically the Secretary General. And my question is regarding the Middle East, specifically Arab countries. Which trends do you see there, including Israel and Palestine? Thank you.
Okay, well, there's a lot in that question. Let me take on a bit of it. We were very disappointed that the Secretary General didn't follow up when Agnes Callamard came forth with her very strong report on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Because, Calamar did what she could with available information. The only real way to get further to the bottom of who specifically ordered the murder, how high up in the Saudi government did that go, would really be to get to certain intercepts, which were not going to be turned over absent an explicit appeal from the Secretary General. And so his refusal to take on the Saudis, because they were a wealthy, powerful member, meant that we didn't get anything beyond what Agnes Calamar could report. On Israel-Palestine, one of our disappointments has been Michelle Bachelet's stalling in the publication of the database that she was mandated to, or her office was mandated to compile by the UN Human Rights Council, of companies that are doing business with Israel's illegal settlements. And that report is done. It has been sitting on her desk for 15 months now, and it hasn't been published. Now, why is that? There clearly has been, let's put it this way, there has been no support for its publication from the Secretary General. Indeed, probably the contrary. It would be very simple for him to say, let's just go. It's a simple public statement, and I'm sure it'd be published the next day. But, because the Secretary General is worried about retaliation from Trump and all that, the thing is stalled. And it is undermining the credibility of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, because you can't be defending human rights but then, not exercise this clear mandate just because the focus is the one government other than itself that the United States cares to defend. So that's an example where stronger leadership from the Secretary General could still make a difference. We're very hopeful that Bachelet will finally issue this database before the forthcoming session of the UN Human Rights Council, which is in March. So let's see. But it would just take, one sentence from the Secretary General and it'd be done the next day.
Efe?
Thank you. Mario Villar, Agencia EFE from Spain. Follow up on Latin America. Aside from Venezuela, could you comment on the wave of protests that we've seen in the past few months and the response by governments and consequences for the future in the region? Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's obviously a big question. Let me choose one case, and then we can go beyond that if you want. But in the case of Chile, where there were obviously big protests, and the police responded much more brutally than they should have. There clearly was excessive use of force repeatedly. Now, to Chile's credit, the president invited Human Rights Watch in to conduct an investigation. We had full cooperation of the government. We found this repeated use of excessive force, and the government has promised to make amends. So we will follow up and see if that is the case. But that kind of, overly violent response, unnecessarily violent response to quite legitimate protests was troubling. And you see, parallels to that, obviously, in Nicaragua. We saw that, some of that in Bolivia. We've seen in a different variation, in Brazil, not in that case against protesters, but against, the cartels in the favelas, where summary execution seems to be the norm. So there is, a broad problem with excessive use of force. Probably the most deadly example is Mexico, where again, it's not protesters, it's the cartels. But the so-called drug war, initiated under President Calderon and continued under Peña Nieto and now under AMLO, has been a disaster. 60,000 people disappeared, something like that. And the reason for that is, first of all, the bringing the military in. The military doesn't do law enforcement. They're trained to, to fight a war, to shoot and kill. So it's not a surprise that you get what you get. But it's also a problem of justice because there has been impunity. And so, what the good thing you can say for Chile is they've invited us in, so let's see if they now act on that. But in places like Brazil or Mexico, it's the problem of impunity. In Brazil's case, the active encouragement of impunity. In Mexico's cases, AMLO is talking now about reform. We'll have to see what comes of that. But this green light to violence by security forces is a problem that we see really across many of the governments of Latin America.
Le Monde and then Reuters, and then I'll come over to this side of the room.
Hi, I'm Carrie Nutton for Le Monde and RFI. The report is pointing out concerning France the police violations and police crowd control methods. Last week there was another civilian who died actually during an interpellation, and it's a growing debate within the French society. Have you engaged with French authorities about it?
We have. I mean, there have been, there've been scores of investigations announced into police abuse against protesters. There have just been a handful of prosecutions, and as far as I know, there just were 2 people who have been convicted, each given a suspended sentence. So, nothing, in other words. No serious message to the police that violence against protesters is not accepted. So, Macron has made a big political effort to respond to the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, to hear their concerns, to somewhat modify his policies. But when it comes to the police response to these protests, and the protests have sometimes been violent, I don't deny that, but the police response has also often been quite violent. And so far, we don't see the serious accountability effort that is required to ensure that the police also uphold the rule of law with respect to their own conduct.
Thank you. Michelle Nichols from Reuters. Just following on from your denial of entry into Hong Kong, are you aware of any attempts by China to stop you from holding this event here at the UN? And you touched upon press freedom in China. Could you elaborate for us a little bit on some of the perhaps more surprising issues of press freedom that came up during the past year in places like Australia?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of here, I think you'll have to, ask the Secretary General's office and maybe ask, UNCTAD's leadership here. I just don't know. I mean, I've not been personally privy to any communications between the Chinese government and anyone here, so I'm just going to stay out of that one. But it's a question that's worth asking. In Australia, I mean, to be honest, we have not focused on restrictions on media freedom there. I mean, our focus really in Australia has been the horrible practice of detaining asylum seekers, seemingly forever in Nauru and Manus. And, some of them have, some were brought to the United States. The children and families have been brought to the mainland. There have been some medical cases that have been brought to the mainland. But when it comes to the vast majority of the men who are stuck there, the Australian government seems to just want to send a message of cruelty as a way of deterring anybody else from arriving by boat. And even letting them go to New Zealand is out of the question. New Zealand's too nice. They can go to Cambodia or nothing at all. And that is, it's horrible cruelty. My colleagues have gone there a number of times. They've spoken to these people, and they are, suffering completely needlessly just for the Australian government to make a political point. And it's time for that to stop.
Over there. Oh, okay. We'll go over to you in a minute.
Thank you so much. This is Samira Sadek with Interpress Service. I have 2 questions which relate to the Rohingya crisis and the refugees. You mentioned that China uses diplomatic clout to silence global institutions, and there have been experts who've said that Security Council has consistently failed to act against Myanmar because of China. And I'm curious to know if there are any concerns that the Gambia, which recently filed a lawsuit against Myanmar, could suffer with their relationship with China, which has been thriving in the past few years for taking these actions against Myanmar. And my second question is with regards to India, where there's been a hearing going on since 2017 about deportation of Rohingya refugees from India back to Myanmar. Are there any concerns that the Rohingya refugees are under graver threat because of the recent Citizenship Amendment Act, which specifically targets Muslim refugees from neighboring countries? Thank you.
All right, you threw a lot into those questions. All right. Well, I mean, with respect, look, I don't know of any specific threat by China against Gambia. What Gambia did was incredibly brave, and it's a precedenting case to charge genocide against a government, a distant government. There's no direct Gambian interest in this other than upholding the rule of law. But to file a genocide case before the World Court is a very big deal. And at this point, it's the only kind of accountability that we have. One appalling thing is that Aung San Suu Kyi chose to lead the defense. And one element of this that is not generally appreciated, this initial hearing that took place a few weeks ago was actually not about the merits of the genocide case. It was about what are known as provisional measures. It was about protecting the roughly 450,000 Rohingya who are still in Rakhine State, still within Myanmar. So these are the people who are living terrified in displaced person camps, in surrounded villages, unable to move, often unable to tend to their fields. They are, extremely at risk of the same violence that sent 730,000 of their compatriots fleeing to Bangladesh a couple of years ago. So why did Aung San Suu Kyi go and block, or try to block, the World Court from protecting the remaining Rohingya, given what clearly is an enormous threat that was recently exercised? That's utterly appalling. And I think people haven't focused on the fact that it's not just defending past action that she was there for. She was defending the future, defending against efforts to protect the Rohingya who still live in Myanmar. And so, certainly neither India nor anyone else should send Rohingya back to Myanmar. I mean, that's just a given. Your question about, the recent citizenship law, it obviously, excludes Muslims. That's been widely reported. It also, excludes other governments. I mean, it was really targeted only against, basically people who are fleeing Bangladesh, Pakistan, or Afghanistan. In other words, 3 Muslim majority countries. And so it doesn't provide protection for people who are fleeing Myanmar, among other places. It also doesn't provide protection for, say, Tamils who are fleeing Sri Lanka. But the, and the government says, oh, well, we're just protecting people who are persecuted by these Muslim majority countries. But that's not even honest. Because if you look in, say, Pakistan, who is being persecuted? Well, some of them are Muslims. The Ahmadi, Shia, same thing in Afghanistan where the Shia are under attack. So, often it is Muslims who are victimized. But India is basically not interested in protecting Muslims. This is kind of a discriminatory anti-Muslim law. And of course, part of why people are so exercised is not only the blatantly discriminatory nature of the citizenship law, but also fear that it will be combined with a citizenship verification process that could lead many people to lose their citizenship and their right to live in India. Because if people are going to have to prove their citizenship on the basis of documents that, many poor people never have, you can see kind of a massive de-citizenship process, massive expulsions theoretically. So, this is why there have been such widespread protest in India. And of course, the Modi government has responded to these protests in its typically disrespectful for human rights way. I guess most recently with the police just standing by while thugs attacked Nehru University in Delhi. So we are, extremely concerned about the anti-Muslim drift of the Modi government, exemplified by its actions in Kashmir, its actions in Assam, and now most recently this discriminatory anti-Muslim citizenship law.
Hey, wait, the mic is coming towards you. Thank you.
Thank you. Majid Ghali, Rudao Media Network. I have 2 questions. The first one is about Northeast Syria. As you know, the humanitarian crisis there, due to the announcement of withdrawal of U.S. forces and the Turkish invasion, still going. My question for you, and I'm hoping to hear a yes or no answer, is do you think what's happening there is an ethnic cleansing campaign? And what do you think the international community's reaction should be, proper reaction for this? And my second question is more general, more broad, about human rights situation globally. We are entering a new decade. If you could tell us, do you notice any trend of human rights violation globally, especially when it's come to impunity and looking the other way? We are seeing all over the world continuous human rights violation, but is there increase or decrease, and do you notice any trend in this in general?
Right.
Thank you.
I love these simple questions. Okay. First, with respect to Syria, I want to just say as a preface, our big concern is Syria is Idlib province, which is not your question. but in northwestern rather than northeastern Syria. And the reason I say that is because there are still to this day 3 million civilians at risk of indiscriminate bombardment by Syrian and Russian forces. For the moment, there's yet another one of those ceasefires. It could break down like all the others have. And Turkey still has closed the border. And so either you're going to have a bloodbath if the fighting continues the way it has been, or you could have a new refugee crisis if Turkey opens the border to avoid a bloodbath, but it's not going to accept 3 million refugees without also allowing people to cross the Aegean. So this is, I answered that first. Now I move to the Northeast. Now, Trump was was criticized for sort of, abandoning the Syrian Kurdish forces that had worked very effectively with U.S. forces to fight ISIS, basically giving the green light to Turkish forces to come in. The agreement was to kind of create a strip along the border, which the forces would have to withdraw from. And we are quite concerned that as that's implemented, you will see Kurdish villagers fleeing. Not all of the villages are Kurdish. Some of them are Arab, but quite a number of them are Kurdish. And just as in northwestern Syria, where Turkish forces came in and many Kurds felt the need, at least, to flee, we would worry about a similar process taking place in northeastern Syria. Now, the militia that Turkey has been sponsoring have been abusive. We've seen some executions, we've seen pillaging, we've seen the seizure of property, and we've seen no serious effort by Turkey to rein those in, to hold them accountable. And so if that continues, that's precisely what could lead to large-scale population displacement. And so it's a work in progress. So I can't answer your question yes or no. It's kind of an issue that's underway. But that's our concern. That's what we're looking at very closely right now. The global question, that's a big, big question. The International Criminal Court has been stymied by a number of factors. Some of them are internal, and there is fortunately a review process going on among the states parties to the Rome Treaty, which is going to look at not simply the prosecutor's office, but also the behavior of the judges, which have been problematic in some cases, such as the Afghan case. But there is, separately from that, we can't look at the ICC as the sole mechanism. The good news is that both the General Assembly here with respect to Syria and the Human Rights Council with respect to Myanmar have adopted complementary procedures, the so-called IIIM for Syria, or the similar procedure for Myanmar, to at least collect the evidence and to make prosecutions possible when we find a forum. And a number of European governments using universal jurisdiction have begun to step forward with national prosecutions against quite senior Syrian officials. France and Germany in particular have done that. So, as is typical, the impunity question, the accountability question is complicated. But there have been positive developments, and the Gambia-Myanmar question is another example of an unusual, really an unprecedented step, but a path-breaking step, which I hope will be replicated should the need arise in other cases as well.
Sorry, I just want to add one point about impunity globally, because who's going to hold the Chinese government accountable for the mass arbitrary detention of 1 million people simply on the basis of their ethnicity or their identity? How is that going to happen? That's a political question. It's clear legally that what they're doing is incorrect. It's a political question about who's going to muster the guts to establish a process and make it work. And I think that's a very important question to ask, because if China can get away with this, I think we really have to ask ourselves what else the Chinese government can get away with at home or abroad.
So we're only going to take a couple more questions. There's somebody at the back first.
Hi. I'm sorry. Is this not a good spot? Yeah, hi. All right. My name is Kevin Pinner. I'm a resident correspondent here for Sankei Shimbun, a Japanese newspaper. and I've been trying to raise the Xinjiang issue at the UN for about a year and a half now. I have two questions about that. I'm glad to see you guys talking about it. You had mentioned, basically it falls under the rubric of what can we do? You mentioned sanctions are one thing, but what can individuals and journalists who are trying to affect change in China's Xinjiang policies, the Strike Hard campaign, do, given that it's an incredibly opaque government and we can never expect Chinese media to put any pressure on their own government about this? How can individuals, and I was wondering, you mentioned supply chains.
No.
That governments could address this problem through perhaps some kind of boycotting of supply chains. What companies are doing the most business with Xinjiang that individuals right now could stop supporting?
Well, okay, in terms of the question, first, how do you build pressure on the Chinese government for its conduct in Xinjiang? I think we're already getting inklings of what they care about, because as you had this joint statement of 24 or so governments on Xinjiang, as there's been more publicity about Xinjiang, the Chinese government has hardly been impervious. They've actually reacted, and they announced that all the detention is ended. Everybody can go home. Obviously not true, but why would they bother making that announcement? They've organized these show tours. And they're a joke. They show all these people singing and dancing, and pretend that it's lovely to be in detention. But why would they bother doing that if this wasn't striking a chord? So the fact that the Chinese government so far has been using kind of ham-fisted PR techniques is actually, we should take heart from that they're feeling the heat, and we should be redoubling these efforts. I think that the Chinese government particularly cares about, say the 57 members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I don't think it expects to have a lot of friends among Western governments, but it certainly is spending a lot of money through the Belt and Road Initiative to try to buy support among governments in the developing world. And so there, I think that should be a big focus, because if you're a Muslim majority country, why are you indifferent to the worst case of mistreatment of Muslims in the world? And that's a question that people are beginning to ask in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Turkey, in Albania, in Gambia, in Qatar. So we're beginning to see governments that are stepping back from that. One interesting thing is that the OIC statement lauding China's wonderful treatment of the Muslims was actually not joined by half of the members of the OIC. So that's encouraging. So I think that pointing out when governments do or do not do the right thing with respect to Xinjiang is a very important thing for journalists and for the public to do. The question about supply chains, it's come out really only in the last few months that these million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims are not simply in detention, but many of them are in forced labor. And the production process in China is often very opaque. But the burden, this is not about boycotting, this is just about the burden on every company to ensure that it is not complicit in serious human rights violations. And it's now understood that that's not a matter of simply having, your own clean factories. It's a matter of ensuring that you have a clean supply chain. So the burden is really on any government, any company that is sourcing in China to give us provable assurances that it is not complicit in the use of forced labor. And it's up to those companies to push down the supply chain. And if they can't do it, then they're going to have a hard time living up to their human rights responsibilities.
I think the last question will be here.
Thank you. Gakushala with Asahi Shimbun, Japanese newspaper. My question is Japanese criminal justice system, which is getting attention after Mr. Carlos Ghosn escaped from Japan. So Department of Justice in Japan issued a statement a few days ago, quote, Japan's criminal justice system sets out appropriate procedures and is administered properly to clarify the truth in case while guaranteeing basic individual human rights. In report, you also criticize the Japanese criminal system, and do you have any response to the statement by Department of Justice in Japan? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen that particular statement, but if what you're reading is accurate, it's just not true. And I say this, I'm not defending what Ghosn may or may not have done. We're not his defense team. I'm not defending his flight. But his case illustrates the enormous pressure that the Japanese criminal justice system places on defendants to confess, including, endless interrogation without lawyers present. In Ghosn's case, he was deprived. He couldn't even speak to his wife. He was obviously incommunicado detention effectively for a long time, but even once he was freed on bail, he was, denied the ability to speak with his wife. And so, all of this is, part of the pressure put on criminal suspects that leads to 99% of them being convicted and many, many of them confessing. And so, a criminal justice system that is so determined to put pressure on suspects that the vast majority confess is not a justice system. It's a confession system. And I think that this is an opportunity, the Ghosn case, for there to be real serious scrutiny of the way that the Japanese government runs its criminal justice system.
Thank you. We have to wrap up now. I know there are still questions. So if you want to speak to Ken afterwards, please find me or my colleague Philippa in the room. She's the one with the purple hair. Thank you all for joining us in the room, and also to the people on the live stream. And we're going to conclude now. Thank you very much.
Well, I think as you have spent so much time doing the presentation on China, our Chinese leader at least deserve one chance to ask, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead. We didn't see you. I'm sorry.
Can someone give her the microphone?
I'm sorry that I didn't see you. Yes. Please feel free to take the mic and ask a question.
We'll keep going for a second.
So I'm from China Media Group, a Chinese reporter based here in the UN. So I've actually read the reports, and I see that when you're describing that students in Australia, university students in Australia are doing the protest to support Hong Kong protesters, you use them as silent protests. But when you use other students who hold different opinions, you describe them as pro-government and pro-Beijing. So in my understanding, it seems that anyone is against the Chinese government is on the right side of truth and the reality, and anyone's holding different opinions, government is supported. So my question would be, where does this assumption or presumption come from? And also about the Hong Kong protest, you say that when policemen are exercising their duties, you use forcibly against the civilians or whatever this kind of words. But when you are describing the protesters when they are causing riots across the Hong Kong street, you say that they are just choosing their different ways to express their anger, and even they set fire on an ordinary civilian in his 60s. So I want to ask, where do these double standards come from? Thank you.
Well, I think they come from your imagination because you're not describing what we say accurately. So let's take the students first. We're all for students having different points of view. They can be pro or anti-China. It's up to them. Our reporting, and Sophie can give more detail on this, but what we have found is that many Chinese students abroad are afraid to voice criticism of Beijing for fear of retaliation. They feel that and they report to us that their comments are reported back to authorities and that there are repercussions for their family back home. That's not something that happens with students who voice pro-Beijing sentiments. So this is not a double standard. This is just a fact reported to us by students who feel that their academic freedom is very actively impeded by the Chinese government, even abroad. This is part of the government's effort to extend its domestic censorship overseas. With respect to Hong Kong, we in no sense condone violence by the protesters, and I would dare you to find a single statement in any of our publications that in any sense condone the violence. Our point is that when police respond, whether to violence or to peaceful protest, they have to do it within the rules on legitimate use of force. And we've seen over and over use of tear gas against peaceful protesters. We've seen severe beating of protesters, which is not an appropriate response to peaceful or violent protesters. And we've seen large-scale detention of protesters. not all of whom, as far as we can tell, have been engaged in violence. So that's our concern. It's not a double standard. We're trying to hold the Hong Kong police to the same standards that we hold police around the world, which is not to use excessive force and to respect the rule of law and the rights of protesters.
I understand that the Chinese mission wishes to speak also.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. I just want to make a few remarks regarding the report. I just want to make a few remarks. I'm not going to raise any questions. My remarks first is that I have been. My name is Jishen from Chinese Mission. I'm covering the third committee human rights issues here in the UN. First, that what you said is I have been listening very carefully. I have been going through your report just very roughly, and I found that the report is full of prejudices and fabrications, and ignore the factual information provided by my government repeatedly for all these years, and picked up all these fabrications and prejudices and making groundless accusations. We totally reject the content of all these reports. The second is that we have been making every efforts to advance the human rights in China. The human rights stories have been one of the most successful in the human race, including we have been lifting more than 700 million people out of poverty for past 40 years. So any report talking about Chinese human rights without mentioning this fail to be balanced and neutral. And any organization fail to mention that cannot claim to be a human rights organization. Okay, and about your entry into China, Hong Kong is part of China, I think. So I think given what you said here, I think it's clear to all why you have been barred such entry. Thank you.
What's your name again?
My name is Jishen from Chinese Mission. Jisheng. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
We'll give Ken the last word on this.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me just say a word then. I mean, first, we actually, if you note in the introduction, in my introduction to the World Report, we actually mentioned the fact that it was the emancipation of the Chinese people to actually engage in to lift themselves out of poverty. That is one of the great accomplishments within China of the last several decades. Whether that's the government's doing or whether it's just the government standing back from its prior policies of constraining the Chinese people is something we could discuss. I would ask you, what specific falsehood is there? I mean, it's easy to kind of make these arguments about you're false, you're biased, but what did we get wrong? If there's something wrong, we obviously would change it. But it's like one of the reasons the Chinese Foreign Ministry yesterday, one of the things they said is that, I didn't recognize China's progress on human rights. The progress like detaining 1 million Uyghurs and Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, the progress like building the most intrusive surveillance state the world has ever seen, the progress like utterly shutting down every critic and civil society organization in the country, the progress like undermining the one country, two systems agreement for Hong Kong. I mean, yeah, that's the progress I didn't acknowledge. We rather just reported what happened, but we didn't call it progress. So, if there's something we got wrong, please say so. But we were very careful here. We are, only report the facts as best as we can. And, rather than just give us this blank, empty rhetoric, please show us what we got wrong.
I'm just going to add 2 quick points. One is that we regularly, in the course of doing research on issues across China, send the Chinese government and different ministries letters asking questions that's relevant to the work that we're doing. In the 14 years I've been at Human Rights Watch, we have never gotten a single response. And I also just want to clarify one point unambiguously, that people across China lifted themselves out of poverty after the government got its boot off their collective neck. Thank you.
And on that note, we will end the press conference since it's a little bit late. Thanks to everybody for your participation. See you soon.
Sorry, Ken, we need to go do.
I'm sorry, I got
Sorry,
that.
you guys pull in the.
Look at, work the key, yeah, they'll take that.